most naval stories start at sea. In fact, some of Britain's greatest stories from the Age of Sail come from shipwrecks that marine archaeologists like me help discover and recover. I'm Lowri Roberts, a marine archaeologist for Wessex Archaeology, and I'm investigating the unique and fascinating tale of how an American naval frigate ended up on dry land in Hampshire, England. Unlucky in its construction and in battle, this American ship still had a huge impact on British maritime history. From clashing sea captains to geopolitical posturing, the legacy of this unlucky frigate is more tantalising than your average deep-sea mystery. This is the story of USS Chesapeake. Walking through Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, it's easy to fathom the impact that the Royal Navy had on Great Britain and the rest of the world. Staunch sea captains, impressive ships, and of course, unrivaled naval supremacy form some of the stereotypical images we may have about the Royal Navy. So how does an American heavy frigate come into it? Well, despite the grandeur of this historic dockyard, Britain's naval supremacy hasn't always been smooth sailing. During the Age of Sail, Britain and the rest of the world saw the dominance of sailing vessels in global trade and maritime warfare. It was during this period that Britain established itself as a seafaring force to be reckoned with, thanks in part to their shipbuilding. By the 18th century, shipbuilding at the Royal Dockyards was on a vast industrial scale. This scale was so large that the Royal Dockyards constituted the largest industrial organisation in the Western world. The historic dockyard is home to a number of important British vessels from all ages. Behind me, we can see HMS Victory. She looks a little bit different without her masts and is currently undergoing a 10 to 15 year conservation project costing £35 million. The conservation project is on a massive scale, but the Victory has never done anything by halves. Over 2,000 oak trees were used in the construction of the hull alone. That's over 60 acres of forest. And costing £50 million in today's money, you can imagine that keeping track of the timbers that built her was a vital and intricate process. And it's this timber process that we'll be looking at as we unravel the story of the USS Chesapeake. Vessels like these aren't the only way we can see ships' timbers. I'm heading to the Sallyport Inn to explore timber reuse and speak to the owner, Mark Smith. Hi Mark, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, and welcome to the Sallyport Inn.
Thank you very much. This place is amazing. How long have you guys been here?
So we actually bought the premises about 7 years ago, but it took us a while to get our backside into gear, plus a bit of negotiation with the council on what we could and couldn't do with it. And actually did all the restoration work during lockdown 1 and reopened on July the 4th and featured as the main pub on ITV News.
Wow, that's incredible. So you did all the restoration yourself?
Yeah, obviously I had a team in there helping me, but yes, I managed the whole project.
And did you uncover anything special during the restoration?
Really exciting stuff, from old newspaper clippings to a few old coins, but I suppose more interestingly, we had to replace a lot of the wood in the roof and some of the structural wood and replace it with steel and new timber. But some of the old timber we found had lots of etchings in the ends of it, which were really interesting, and I had no idea what they were.
And how did you go about discovering what they were?
Well, I had a look online to begin with and drew up a complete blank. A few people said it might have been a Patrapake, which is the ancient form of witchcraft, where they would keep the witches out and carve all these, or scratch all these bits into the wood. But I put it out to the wise public on the social media sites such as Twitter, and everybody reliably came and told me that actually they're old shipwright marks, and that's how they used to etch the instructions on how to put the wood into places because they couldn't read or write.
Absolutely, that's incredible. And was this bar always here, or did you make this as well?
No, the bar used to be over in the corner over there in the 70s, and then back in the 90s it was at the back there. But this bit, as you see now, all actually brand new, but made out of all the old reclaimed wood. I particularly like this 700 and 800 year old oak that's in here. This long bit here actually washed up out the front of my house during a really big storm we had a few years ago, which is an old deck plate from a wreck that's been buried at sea for a couple of 100 years, and I knew exactly where it was going to go.
Amazing. Do you think that's your favourite part of the building, or have you got another favourite?
I have to say the bar is probably my favourite bit, although I do like some of the architectural carpentry that's been done upstairs. It's interesting to look at to see how they managed to fit everything together and actually push the weight into the central posts.
Absolutely. On that note, do you mind if I go and have a look around upstairs?
You fill your boots, help yourself.
Amazing. Thanks, Mark. As we come to the upper layers of the Sallyport Inn, it's incredible to see that these large structural timbers are actually reused ship's timbers. It's evident that the timber above me has been on the seabed because it displays gribble worm holes. Gribble worms are small marine isopods that burrow deep into the wood, and we see them often on reused timbers. It's exciting to think that that timber might once have been used on a Royal Navy frigate. Gribble worm isn't the only way that I can tell a timber once belonged to a ship. Surviving timber marks like these can tell marine archaeologists like me a few things about the ships that they came from. Timber marks can indicate which part of the ship the timber was used on, which in turn can tell us the size of the vessel. They can also give us clues into the people who built them. Marks like these very rarely survive underwater, if at all, and it's only through reuse of ship's timbers that we are able to consider them into the archaeological record. To help us decipher these curious marks, we need to put them into context of the shipbuilding process at the Royal Dockyards. From documentary sources, we know that timber management and marking was broken down into several stages. Timber was procured through contract from either the Royal Forests or through private landowners. Experienced surveyors known as purveyors were sent out to find and select the best trees for the ships that were going to be built. Once the trees were found, they were marked with a progressive number and put into a report stating which bit of the ship would be built by that specific tree. Once at the yard and measured, the timber was ready for seasoning and storage and was stacked in designated seasoning sheds. When the timber was ready, the process of selection, moulding and conversion began, and the wood was sent to the saw pits. Once cut, the wood was sent onto the building ways where the ship could finally begin to take shape. The final stage in our timber journey is one that leads us to places like the Sallyport Inn. This final phase is timber reuse. Once the ship's time at sea was over, rather than let the wood go to waste, the timber was sold for use in construction. But these are just glimpses. Our next location provides a marine archaeologist like me with a chance to get up close and personal to an incredible piece of our naval history. Standing outside this 19th century mill in Wickham, Hampshire, it's strange to think that inside are the remains of an American naval frigate, USS Chesapeake. Built in 1820, Chesapeake Mill offers a unique example of ship timber reuse in an industrial context. What's even more significant is that the ship's timbers present within the mill are from a single identifiable vessel. The timbers, around 90 in total, were purchased by a Mr. John Pryor in 1820. Timbers on the ground floor and first are either from the gun deck, the upper deck, or the berthing deck, the lower deck. And throughout, we can see more beams, ledges, and even planking. By looking at these, we can begin to unravel the Chesapeake's history. Ghost outlines, notches, beveled edges, and of course, timber marks each represent a moment in Chesapeake's history. My favourite mark is this lozenge-shaped burn mark on one of the deck beams, possibly caused by a candle, a lantern, or even the flash of a discharged cannon. To help unravel this incredible history, I'm joined by Dr. Dan Atkinson, a bit of a timber mark specialist. Hi Dan, so we're here at Chesapeake Mill, and the beams within this structure are pretty impressive, aren't they? But the service of the Chesapeake isn't quite as impressive?
Well, maybe not at first sight, But the Chesapeake was actually one of several frigates that was commissioned by Congress in 1796 to protect the merchant vessels and trade routes during their war at the time with Algiers in North Africa. So in 1799, the Chesapeake was actually finished. They'd managed to get the timber supplies from across the eastern seaboard of the United States. They'd managed to get all the other supplies that they needed. And they finished the Chesapeake in 1799, and she was taken into service. That service actually was pretty unremarkable, essentially protecting the merchant vessels in the North Atlantic at that time. That's really about it.
So how did the Chesapeake actually come to the attention of Royal Navy Captain Philip Brooke?
Well, Philip Brooke was a very experienced captain, and of course was very much aware of the war that had just started between the United States and Great Britain, the War of 1812, which essentially came about due to Royal Naval vessels taking American sailors from merchant vessels primarily at the time, which led to a lot of disagreement and a lot of angst with the United States Navy, as you can imagine. And so the United States and Great Britain went to war in 1812. Now, at that time, the United States Navy, they'd built 6 heavy frigates. They were quite different from the Royal Naval lighter built frigates. They were absolutely decimating the Royal Navy. There had been several actions where the United States frigates had beaten the Royal Naval vessels outright. And Captain Philip Brooke was very much aware that this wasn't something that could continue. And so he was determined, along with the Royal Navy, to do something about it and capture, or at least try and understand more about the United States heavy frigates and what was different about them and why they were so successful against the Royal Navy at the time. So that was really Philip Brooke's motivation, and he later went on to captain HMS Shannon, and HMS Shannon with her crew were then put through rigorous gunnery drills. He actually masterminded the gunnery school at Whale Island in Portsmouth, and in the end he managed to train the crew to the point where they were probably the best trained crew in the Navy at the time.
I actually have a letter here from Captain Brooke of the Royal Navy to Captain Lawrence, basically calling him out for a fight. And it says, "Sir, as the Chesapeake appears now ready for sea, I request that you will do me the favour to meet the Shannon with her, ship to ship, to try the fortunes of our respective flags." So can you describe that scene on the eve of battle? What were people thinking was going to happen?
Well, obviously the United States Navy had had several very decisive victories against the Navy. And the mood was, you know, business as usual, really, as everybody was really expecting it to be another victory for the United States Navy. Now, obviously, Brooke had a very different idea, but Lawrence was determined to serve his flag, and as was his crew. And all the population of Boston would have been in a similar mood. They all went out on the morning of the 1st of June to actually see the action, which would have been just half a mile to a mile off the shore, and they would have been elated. They would have been ecstatic. They were expecting a victory.
So when the two ships actually clashed, what happened?
So the ships came into contact around 11 o'clock on the morning of the 1st of June. Now, it was probably one of the quickest, most devastating naval actions in the history of the two navies, and possibly even in the age of sail. After 11 minutes, half the crew of the Chesapeake were killed. The decks were awash with blood, running out of the scuppers. The Shannon had lost about a third of her crew as well. Brooke was actually injured as he led the boarding party to capture the Chesapeake, and Lawrence himself was also mortally wounded. And this is where the reputations of both navies are actually built into folklore, and particularly the United States Navy in particular. Lawrence's last words before he died was, "Don't give up the ship." So you can imagine this is quite evocative for the United States Navy today.
So what actually became of the Chesapeake?
Well, the Chesapeake was taken to Halifax Dockyard in Nova Scotia in Canada. She was towed into the harbour behind the Shannon, where the shipwrights and the master shipwright were able to really study not just the battle damage, but also to understand what made these heavy frigates so special and so successful. So lots of surveys were undertaken. She was studied meticulously. They took lots of measurements. They made lots of plans and drawings of the ship. At which point, this then could give them, in effect, a blueprint to be able to send back to the Admiralty, so that the naval architects could pore over it and understand what this really meant. She left Halifax probably about a year after she was first taken in, and sailed across the Atlantic with a Royal Naval crew, and this also gave them a really good opportunity to understand the sailing qualities of these heavy frigates, which were actually pretty impressive given that they were heavily built. So that was really, really important for the Navy to understand not just the construction but also the sailing qualities too. So she was taken into Portsmouth and went into service, did one cruise to South Africa, to the Cape, on convoy duty, at which point the Napoleonic Wars ended, and then she was taken into reserve or into ordinary in Plymouth after the war had ended.
And once she's decommissioned and not actually in service anymore, she's sold off, isn't she?
That's right, she is sold. She was sold to the mill owner here, John Pryor, in 1819. She was actually broken up in Portsmouth in the Pest House Yard, just to the north of the current Dockyard. And a portion of the timbers, which were advertised in the local newspaper, were then bought by John Pryor, the mill owner. Now, this sort of practice of taking vessels apart, reusing the timbers, selling the timbers off for repurposing or other purposes is not uncommon. Britain was a thrifty nation. They were reusing everything. Timber supplies were in short supply. The demand for timber was high. And so this was a perfect opportunity to reuse timbers from ships that were being sold and broken up at the time. So the timbers were brought to the mill. We have timbers mainly from the decks, actually, but they're absolutely perfect. They're already converted, they're straight, they're ideal, and they are essentially floor joists. Yeah. So this is where we are now.
Not only can we see timber marks relating to Chesapeake's construction, we can also see her scars from battle.
You can see on the beam in front of us here and above us, this beam is probably from towards the stern or the rear end of Chesapeake, probably around the captain's cabin. And we know from the surveys and the battle damage surveys that were done at Halifax Dockyard, where the cannonballs actually entered the Chesapeake, being fired from the Shannon. And in fact, many of them ended up coming straight down the deck and actually hitting a lot of the beams on the way. And we think that this is a very good example of that, and in fact the only example of that. But you can see the crack, and you can see also where they seem to have tried to mend or at least reinforce the beam with bolts and probably metal brackets to strengthen the beam. So a real poignant reminder of the battle itself and the survival of it within the mill today.
The timber marks that Dan has shown me expose not only the ship's construction, but Chesapeake's battle scars and her fight for survival. And once in the hands of the British Royal Navy, she faced another threat. During this period of naval warfare, it wasn't uncommon to steal other countries' ship designs. Through survey and repair, the secrets to her build success were revealed to the British, and Captain Lawrence's famous last words of "Don't give up the ship" were stripped away with each new insight they gained. But what of her legacy? How did heavy frigates like USS Chesapeake influence the future ship designs for the British Royal Navy? We know that heavy frigates were renowned for their supremacy, and the Royal Navy wanted to understand their characteristics and sailing qualities so that they could do it too. This led to the development of the Leader-class frigate and vessels such as the HMS Trincomalee. To learn more about the HMS Trincomalee, I'm joining geospatial specialist Jack Fox-Laverick at Wessex Archaeology to explore how modern techniques provide further insight into the structure and construction of these later ship designs. Hi Jack, how are you?
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. What are you working on?
I'm just currently looking at some of the laser scans we produced for the HMS Trincomalee.
And why is the Trincomalee special?
Well, it's quite special because it's Britain's oldest surviving warship that's still afloat. It's over 200 years old and it currently lives up in Hartlepool in dry dock as part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy's collection. I think it's quite interesting because it was actually built in Bombay, or present-day Mumbai in India. And unlike sort of many of its contemporaries at the time, it's constructed from Malabar teak rather than oak. So after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a shortage of oak due to the sort of demand, the increased demand for warships. So it was constructed out of a different material, which makes it quite unique.
So can you tell me how this technology works and maybe take me through parts of the ship?
Absolutely, yeah. So the laser scanners work by recording millions of points at every sort of setup. So the idea being that if I were to go in and survey one of the cabins, I would have the scanner inside the cabin, I'd have it in the doorway, and then I'd have it outside. So that each time you're repositioning it, it's recording both where it's going and where it's been. And what that enables us to do is start to put all this information together using the software that's bundled with the scanner. And from that, we're able to create what we call slices through the data. So if you think about sort of slicing a cake, when you take that slice out, you're able to see how that cake's been made. It's the same sort of principle. So if we pull up the mess deck, what we're able to do is start to look through this slice of data. So as you can see, it's really quite detailed. There's probably several million points in here comprising up this section of it. So we're actually sort of below head height, but that's kind of what we want to be able to see, because we don't want, obviously, the roof of the deck above us sort of restricting what we're able to see. And we're able to manipulate through the point cloud data and actually examine everything in quite a high level of detail. And then from that, we're able to produce plans like this one. So this has been sort of digitized and put into a 2D format, which just makes it a little bit easier to understand if you don't have access to software that we use to process the laser scans. So within this, we're now able to present that in a much more digestible format. And this is sort of what the museum would be using to help inform their management plan. And it gives you a really clear picture of how the ship is laid out deck by deck.
And does this give us an idea of what the Chesapeake would have been like in terms of size?
There are certainly similarities, yeah. Both ships are about 150 feet in length and about 40 feet wide, and I think their holds, there's only a couple of feet difference between them as well. So I think whilst both ships are similar, I wouldn't necessarily say that the Trincomalee is a direct copy. I think there are elements of its design that were potentially influenced by the Chesapeake, but I think it's quite interesting. There's a record from when the Chesapeake was in the Royal Navy's service from one of its captains, who was actually quite critical of it. He said it was sturdily made and well constructed, but elements of it, particularly its stern, were not well regarded. And I think that potentially might give some suggestion as to why the Trincomalee had its stern quite heavily retrofitted at one point in its history.
At the start of this journey, it was easy to view the USS Chesapeake as an unlucky frigate. But I would argue that it's because of her unlucky service history that we're able to learn so much about her today. Thanks to her influence on British heavy frigates and the reuse of her timbers in Chesapeake Mill, we're able to unravel these exciting stories for generations to come.